Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.
Well, hello and welcome to Engage for Success Radio with me, Jo Moffat. Engage for Success is a not-for-profit movement. We are the UK's leading voice on the topic of employee engagement, and we're raising awareness and running events online and around the country, and indeed online with audiences around the world. We're developing research, publishing case studies, and shining a light on great practice. These weekly radio shows are now streaming live on YouTube, so do search Engage for Success Radio podcast to find them. But you can also sign up or find the full archive of over 11 years now of weekly shows at engageforsuccess.org, where you can also learn more about the movement and sign up for our weekly newsletter. So as I say, I'm Jo Moffat, and I'm one of the three regular hosts for Engage for Success Radio. And as with everyone who supports the movement, we're all volunteers with day jobs. I founded and led Wood Reed, which was a consultancy that leveraged the creative and insight-led approach of the advertising world to engage employees inside organisations. And having sold Wood Reed to 7Cs, the culture consultancy, I now work as a senior consultant. So I'm still very much involved in supporting clients create workplace cultures that make workplaces work for employees as well as their shareholders and stakeholders. So today's topic is one that is incredibly close to my heart. We're on radio show number 630 today, and we're going to be looking at the topic of building high performance team cultures. And I'm very pleased to welcome as our guest this week, Ellie Holbert. Ellie works as a partner to executives, C-suite teams and people leaders. And after years in management consulting, Ellie noticed there was a consistent pattern, a pattern that organizations would happily invest heavily in tools, technology, restructures, but the underlying team dynamics were often quietly eroding organizational performance. So she set about designing human systems that enable and make possible high performance. And today, as the founder of Empact Advisory Services, Ellie, as I say, works with executive teams and people leaders to build high-performance team cultures that actually last. Her approach is fast and focused and research-backed, with many years of consulting expertise across Fortune 200 companies, US federal agencies, as well as for global cultural institutions and high growth teams. So today, Ellie is joining me to talk about discussing human systems that work. So welcome, Ellie.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you so much for having me today.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, and a topic that we're both very passionate about, I think. So tell us, before we kind of get into that, though, just a little bit about yourself. And how you got to the role that you currently deliver, and a little bit about the work that you really focus on today.
Absolutely, I would love to. So as Jo mentioned, my name is Ellie Holbert, and I have a background in management consulting for about a decade. And as Jo mentioned, I found that so many of my clients were pursuing acquiring new tools, new technology, going through reorganizations, making some very significant changes to their business with very high hopes of seeing significant financial and business performance results. And those investments also came with quite a hefty price tag. And I saw organization after organization struggle with investments that should have made a significant impact in their performance because they really had not created the right human systems to realize the high performance that they wanted to see. And by that specifically, I mean leadership capabilities had some gaps, role clarity was not fully established, processes could have been improved or better understood. And a lot of organizations were experiencing the same challenges in place after place, regardless of industry. And so I began to focus on how do we create the right scaffolding, really, the right structure around these human beings we are expecting to perform differently, so that when we bring in a new tool, a new technology, a change, the human beings in place have the clarity, the trust, the information, and the leadership that they need to be effective. And when I took that approach, I was amazed to see teams absolutely transform, often in not that long of a period, really. About 8 weeks was when I saw the most dramatic changes in most teams. And so seeing those results, it was so inspiring because the changes that I was implementing, they're nothing significant or nothing, earth shattering necessarily. It's really just following through on the fundamentals. And so that led me to start my own consultancy where I advise C-suite leaders and executives in the people and culture space to create those high performance cultures using a very repeatable process that works regardless of business size and regardless of industry.
Okay, I've got you. That all sounds really interesting. So Ellie, 8 weeks. I mean, that's quite surprising. I mean, I'm sure you must have been quite surprised by that.
Yes, absolutely. I can provide an overview of that specific case study that was so successful. I entered this organization. It was a financial services organization that was tasked, this particular team of 12 was tasked with a very high visibility, high investment value cybersecurity initiative. And the team that was assembled to do this, they were all new to this organization, and the leader was new as well. So there was very little organizational context and institutional knowledge within this team.
Mm.
And I assessed the health of this team. I found that their engagement scores were critically low. The team initially scored 2.5 out of 5 on average for the measures that we examined. And after seeing that, I designed and implemented a team accelerator program for this team. So we looked at role clarity, making sure that everybody understood what they were there to do, what everybody else on the team was there to do as well. We looked at domain knowledge. So we had knowledge sharing sessions where people were able to provide information about what they were tasked to do in a deeper, richer way, since this was a multifunctional team. We also conducted retrospectives or continuous improvement sessions where the team talked about how they could work more effectively together as a team. So, not necessarily the technical information, but the team itself, the dynamics, the meetings, the communication practices. We continuously refine those over time. We also helped people get to know one another better as people by creating what we called personal canvases or about me profiles and learning more about each other. And then finally, I also coached the leader of this team who was incredibly open-minded about these concepts and very effective. I coached him to create the high performance culture that we wanted to see and to sustain that through very specific observable leadership practices. And so with that approach, pretty concentrated effort over 8 weeks, we reassessed the team and we found that those scores, again, the average of 2.5 out of 5, we actually scored an average of 4.8 out of 5 8 weeks later. And those engagement scores were sustained for over 2 years after this initial program.
Goodness, no, that's impressive stuff, for sure. So thank you for that. I think before we came on air, you were explaining that you tend nowadays to work very much with supporting execs and people teams with their remote workforces. Is that right?
Exactly. Yes. The reason being is that I find that many organizations, although it's been 6 years now since many organizations pivoted to a remote
Mhm.
first way of working, so many organizations and leaders are still really struggling to be effective in a remote or hybrid way of working. And I've uncovered that most of this is because in a remote and hybrid way of working, we rely so heavily on our direct verbal communication. but most organizations still have not trained and equipped their leaders to lead specifically in a remote environment. And so I see a real gap and a real need for support specifically for remote first teams.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So I mean, there's a huge debate, isn't there? And it's certainly the case. It's applying in the UK. I'm sure you're hearing it in the US, because very often where you guys go first, we follow. But there's a lot of discussion and a lot of arguments around the extent to which remote and hybrid work has damaged organizational culture, has weakened organizational performance as a result. And people have become quite entrenched. I mean, I for one am a big fan of remote and hybrid work, and I think remote, hybrid, flexible, it can only be good. But equally, there are some arguments, and I think Edelman's recent trust barometer has shone a little bit of a light on that. Suggested it's made people feel more isolated, and created more silos in our society, which cannot necessarily be too much of a good thing. So what's your take on this? Do you think it's weakened culture and performance? And if not, what do we actually how do we actually convince people that the opposite is true?
It's such a good question. I mean, it's so important to consider not just our connection and culture at work, but also in our lives as a whole. And I really do believe that in-person connection is so important for our mental well-being, our social well-being as human beings. But I don't know that we expect those needs to be met through our workplace any longer. And when we do look at the workplace, what I find is that the cultures that are struggling are those that, excuse me, are those that are still leveraging, I would say, kind of older ways of working in this remote space. And it requires such a different approach. The teams that are the most successful, most connected now are those that really lean into this. And when I say the different approach that's required, I'm talking about how when we move to a remote setting, we lose the majority of communication signals that we rely on as human beings. So we rely on over 9 forms of communication that varies from our verbal words to our body language, the tone of our voice, our facial expressions. We interpret and transmit so many communication signals naturally as human beings to establish trust in our environment, to sense our level of connection with others, to make others feel safe in our presence. And we do this constantly without even thinking of it. But when we move to a remote setting, we lose most of those signals. Only our verbal words remains fully intact. A couple other signals remain somewhat intact, but because of distortions in technology, sometimes those create more ambiguity than they do clarity. And so this means that in a remote setting, we need to really lean into our direct verbal words. But to do so, speaking in that manner, it can feel pretty uncomfortable for most people. It can even feel rude or intimidating if we're doing that without the trust, the psychological safety in place to support that direct verbal communication. And so what I find is that there's a level of leadership effectiveness that needs to be developed specifically with that direct verbal communication in mind, and that we actually have to build trust in a different way than we do in person. We can't do it through these small signals. We do it through things like keeping our word, holding meetings when we schedule them on the calendar, not canceling our one-on-ones last minute, sending people things when we say that we will. If we want to learn about each other as human beings, we have to take time out of our meetings to do that and to use some structure there to do that. So it's really, can we sustain a connected, healthy culture virtually? Absolutely. The highest performing team that I have ever witnessed was an entirely virtual team, but it really does require a different approach to do that.
I absolutely agree with everything you've just said there, and I think all of those things are so important, and people have to be much more intentional about doing these things, don't they, than they perhaps used to have to do.
Yes, absolutely. When we were in person more often, we could patch over simple misunderstandings or miscommunications or gaps. We could easily sense that tension. We could patch it over very quickly. It just isn't like that anymore. And so our thoughtfulness, our intention, and communicating warmth on purpose in very observable ways, that is now what's required of us.
Yes. Yeah. Now, interestingly, I know you tend to work with executive teams, C-suite people, and people teams and so on. But I'm feeling that a lot of what you're describing in terms of the way we should behave and engage with our teams and our people, a lot of that actually comes down to the management tiers below those very senior people, doesn't it?
I would say yes. That's how a lot of these practices will be implemented in day-to-day life. But in my observation, it really requires the highest levels of leadership to be on board with showing up in this way. And for the leaders to
Yes.
really, I would say, own and wayfind, if you will, that culture journey of becoming more direct, becoming more warm, having that structure. It can be very challenging to experiment at the level that's required to implement this playbook, if you will. And so having that coverage from the executive leadership team is so important so that the organization understands at all levels we are on a culture journey together. We are going to make it through this together. It might be a little messy. We may need to experiment, but that experimentation and refinement is the goal. In my experience, unless that is really stated and owned by the executive team, it's not really fair to expect the manager, the middle level managers and the individual contributors, it's just not really fair to expect them to uncover these methods on their own. And it certainly won't scale broadly across the organization, which is what we really want to see for that top performance.
Yeah. So they, as you say, they have to endorse it. They have to set the tone, and they have to. It's this. Definitely not having a gap between what I say and what I do as a senior leader, but them actually role modeling the behaviors that they expect from their own people. And of course, that's the whole trust thing, isn't it? From the very top of the organization, right down through all the different layers of management, down to team leader level, or whatever it might be.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And I would say as well, in a remote setting, people's needs may vary, and that's okay. So it's really about the teams being given permission to co-create the structure that will work for them. Maybe a lot of people on a team need to leave for childcare pickup. That might mean the core business hours shift a little bit to accommodate that. That's okay. Maybe a lot of people on the team are introverts. They don't necessarily need as much of those open-ended visioning conversations. They might prefer, more structure and more of a checklist approach. That's okay. So there's not necessarily a one size fits all. It's about the team needs to be given permission to experiment and co-create the ways of working that work for them based on their unique mission and their unique needs as human beings. But it's that leadership layer's job to give that permission for experimentation and to help people understand what is the acceptable risk taking, what is the acceptable level of autonomy and ownership that people have over processes. Because when we are working remotely, again, the direct verbal communication is everything. So the leaders really need to identify some guardrails and the boundaries of the level of autonomy and ownership and experimentation that's appropriate for teams to find the ways of working that are so uniquely beneficial for them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm sure you're probably familiar with what we call the 4 enablers of engagement at Engage for Success. These are traits that organizations with highly engaged workforces share. And without going through them all, I'm not going to, but one of them is around the role of line managers in terms of treating their people as individuals. So that plays to the point you've just been making, Ellie, about, if you've got some introverts or if you've got people that have got childcare responsibilities, you need to be able to nuance and change your approach or be flexible in your approach to meet those individuals' needs. Equally, one of the other enablers is around listening to employee voice, and that's not just about surveying and finding out to what extent our workforce are engaged, but actually allowing our people to have ideas, process improvement ideas, how they think things could be done differently or better for the customer experience or their own colleagues' experience. So that again is this co-creation that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So there's an awful lot of common ground here. So everything you're saying is absolutely chiming with me. So this is great. Which is annoying because we're romping through our 30-minute slot and we've only got 10 minutes left. So I don't want to. I want to make sure we cover everything that you've got to say. I think one of the things you touched on at the beginning was around ambiguity and how there can often be ambiguity in an online or remote setting that perhaps doesn't always occur in a face-to-face or physical setting, or it's less easily things are less easily misconstrued in that situation. So ambiguity, when people are not clear about what's expected of them. I think there's some neuroscience around that, isn't there, that you found quite interesting?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's so beneficial for leadership to be familiar, even just at a high level, with this neuroscience, because it explains so much of why we behave the way that we do in a remote setting and why so many organizations are struggling with connection and trust, specifically right now. Mm-hmm. So when people are navigating a very high degree of ambiguity, what we find in the neuroscience is that we enter a self-protective state. So ambiguity, that leads to a greater degree of stress in our nervous systems. There can be a tipping point where we actually experience our amygdala, that's our lizard brain, the ancient brain, if you will. It's responsible for fight, flight, freeze. Our amygdala can kind of come online and be activated. And our prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for strategy, higher level thinking, emotional regulation, our prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline. The circuitry of our brain activates the amygdala instead. And when this happens, and by the way, if you've ever had a moment where you had maybe a heated conversation or an argument, you responded in a way where you felt later on like, my goodness, that was not me. I feel so bad I said that. That is not me. That's probably because the part of your brain that's responsible for your personality was not available to you in that moment because of the stress. We see this in remote environments all the time. It might not feel as obvious as an argument, but the circuitry is functioning very much the same, where when we experience a great degree of stress, of ambiguity, of uncertainty, we enter the fight, flight, freeze mode. We operate from a place of self-protection because, again, we are human beings with a brain. Our brain is working so hard to keep us safe. Our brain is not necessarily designed for collaboration, for risk-taking, for innovation, for excellence. It's designed to prioritize our safety. And so it's so important for leaders to understand that we need to create the conditions where our collective nervous system can cool down, if you will, and we can support our teammates and helping their prefrontal cortex be the part of the brain that is firing so that they have access to their best, boldest thinking and their highest quality of work. And we do that by reducing ambiguity wherever we can, of course, understanding we can't eliminate all ambiguity. No. And we do that by continuously transmitting signals of safety and belonging. And that has to be done continuously and sustained over time. A lot of leaders that I speak with, they'll say, well, we talked about this at our all hands, or we said after our engagement survey that this is a safe culture. It's not enough. That's like getting married and saying, well, I told you on our wedding day that I loved you. That's not enough. It has to be said every day. It has to be acted out every day. We know this from our personal lives. It's the same at work. We need to proactively signal safety and belonging and trust in order to expect our people to do their best work.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's what's often known as being in the away state, isn't it? Where you can no longer think creatively or collaboratively or with any kind of concentration if you are, as you say, if you're in this fight and flight mode. And I think we can all think of examples where that's happened actually. So
Exactly.
yeah, interesting stuff. So in the 5 minutes that we've got left, Ellie, I wonder if we could just round off with a little bit of some takeaways for our listeners. So if there were, let's say, 3 simple bits of advice that those listening could take away and apply in their own teams tomorrow, what would they be from your point of view?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. I would say to start, if you are experiencing these challenges, you are in very good company. Most places are, and that's okay. The good news is the playbook has been developed within the last 6 years. There are practices and strategies that you can implement that work universally. And so, if I were to offer 3 specific pieces of advice, number 1 would be focus on role clarity. That means making sure that everybody on the team knows what they are there to do and they can name confidently what everybody else is there to do. It sounds so obvious, but Gallup released research that only 47% of people can name what their job is, what they're supposed to do at their job. So
Really?
the very core basics, we can't take that for granted. I have yet to assess a team where at a baseline, everybody knows what everybody is supposed to do. So I recognize how elementary that sounds, but it's because it is overlooked so frequently. So please start with role clarity. The second thing I would say is implementing one form of continuous improvement. I encourage teams to set aside 60 minutes on a monthly basis as a great starting point and have the team talk about what they should stop doing, start doing, and continue doing to operate more effectively as a team. And then the third one would be take a look at the needs of the individuals on your team and consider how might we structure our operations to better meet these needs? Are people requesting to meet at a different time? Is there a standing meeting that seems to be moved a lot? Really zoom out, look at the ways of working you have in place, and open that up to a dialogue of, is this what we need? You can refine it over time. And I also have a tool, an assessment that can support your team in doing this. I've created a complementary diagnostic. It's called the Team Effectiveness Diagnostic. And this is based on the playbook that I've developed that works in every organization that I have advised. It's a very simple 2-minute diagnostic. I'm happy to send that link to you, Joe. You can take the diagnostic, get a score of your overall team effectiveness, and then also have it broken down by categories with some very specific, practical, actionable insights and ideas that you can implement on your team.
Okay, that would be great. If you could share that link, we can put that on the radio show page and on our website as well for you, Ellie, so people can get hold of that. Because what you've just described there are 3. They are simple, but they're very. I can totally see how they could be very impactful. And that stop, start, continue thing is such a simple thing, but it can be very, very powerful. And what's interesting with those things, those 3 ideas you've just shared, is that they could be done from a senior leadership perspective looking at the organization in a holistic way. But equally, they could be picked up by somebody who is a team leader or a line manager with a small team of half a dozen people. And they could just ask themselves, are we really clear about our objectives in this team and each of our contribution to deliver those objectives, and what I am actually supposed to be doing? What is my role here? Have I got that role clarity? And what can we improve upon? So I think they could be very effective, couldn't they? So yes, do please share that diagnostic, and we'll make sure people can then access that from you. So thank you for that. Lovely. Well, that brings us to our final minute, which really then just remains for me to thank you very much, Ellie Holbert, for joining us today and exploring this topic. I kind of feel we could have talked about it for a lot longer.
Absolutely.
And thank you for listening to Engage for Success Radio. Don't forget you can download or stream any of the great shows from our archive at any time. That is also where you will be able to find the link that Ellie's kindly going to share. And if you want to get involved in the movement, you can get in touch at engageforsuccess.org as well. And also on our homepage, you'll be able to find our latest employee engagement survey and index. The 2025 report is published and available. And if you sign up for our newsletter, you'll be the first to know when the 2026 report is coming out, which will be later on this year. And there are some really interesting findings in that, I know, because I've seen some of the sneak previews. So thank you very much, Ellie Holbert. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining us as a guest. And all it remains is for me to say goodbye and thank you.
Thank you very much, Jo.
Engage for Success Radio, raising the profile of employee engagement and shining a light on good practice for people who believe there's a better way to work.